Good afternoon. My name is Luis Fondebrider. I am forensic anthropologist, and in 1984, I created, together with a group of colleagues, an organization called Argentine Forensic Anthropology Team. The objective at that moment was to assist the families of around 30,000 people who disappeared under the military dictatorship in my country. 37 years later, and while having worked in more than 55 countries around the world, investigating cases of political, ethnic, and religious violence, as a consequence of this, many people became disappeared. In the last 40 years, many countries start to review a recent past of violence. One of the main objectives of that process was to find out what happened with the people who disappeared or were executed by the regime. In many cases, for the family, it's an agony to don't know what happened with the loved ones. They are alive or dead, and where are their bodies and where are the locations of those graves. Very few countries around the world have a permanent program on the search of the disappeared. I can mention now around 15 around the world: Argentina, Guatemala, Colombia, Peru in Latin America. Also, the Balkans, South Africa, Iraq are one of the few countries that at least for 15 years start state and non-state programs searching for the disappeared. But this is not easy work. It has to work together and coordinate different organizations from the state and non-state. Typically, the family of the disappeared do not trust the state institutions for the lack of willingness to investigate, for using methods are not adequate, and also for the lack of a proper documentation and communication with the families of the missing. The investigation process is complex. It's not just an ordinary case, an ordinary homicide, what happened every day around the world. We are trying to investigate massive cases with thousands of people disappear, sometimes in 8 years, sometimes around 30 years, in a consequence that is very complex to address in a single investigation. For a judge, or prosecutors usually are not prepared for this kind of cases because it means to investigate usually stays with all the machinery in action to make people to disappear. When a new instrument is created to investigate these disappearances, so-called a truth commission, a commission of inquiry, on any special mechanisms, these new institutions have to adapt to the state organizations, and that process also is not easy and is complex. Ministers of Defense, of Interior, of Health have to collaborate with the new mechanism, which very often has been created as a mandate by the parliament of the country or by the president of the country. In that new mechanism, we need to consider several elements. The first one is to have willingness to investigate. It's impossible in 5 or 10 years to investigate these processes. For example, in my country, after 40 years, still we are investigating and finding remains of disappeared people. So we need to have permanent mechanisms with an independent mandate, with independent budget, and well-known investigators. At the same time, we need to train and capacitate our forensic investigators. Mainly, Medical Legal Institute will have the task to recover and to analyze the bodies, very often a skeleton after the pass of the time. And most of the medical legal institutes in the world are not prepared to conduct these investigations, which you have hundreds of bodies to analyze and to try to identify. The identification process is one of the main aspects of these challenges faced by many countries. The identification process is not like to take a sample for DNA, as popularly is believed, but it's something more complex which involves to work with different lines of evidence. We are going to conduct an hypothesis and to compare all available information between the people who were disappeared and the bodies recovered from different graves. That process, as I mentioned before, is not just a genetic analysis, it's something more wider and more complex, which involves to compare different kind of information, from medical, odontological, anthropological information about the clothing, the context, etc. The communication with the families is critical. If the families don't trust and don't believe in our work, doesn't make sense to work in spite of the quality of our forensic scientists. We need to build bridges of credibility and trust with the families and communicate accordingly how the process has been done, how the bodies were identified, and to provide to them the forensic report for them to understand how an identification was achieved. As I mentioned before, very few countries have permanent programs in this search and identification process of the dead bodies. Some of them have been successful, and the success is not mentioned about the number of bodies recovered and identified, but also is mentioned about the credibility in the society, the credibility of the families of the disappeared people. I come from a country, Argentina, which is a good example, because now most of the society understand what happened 40 years ago, but in other contexts have been impossible to investigate. I can mention now Sri Lanka, Congo, Somalia, or other countries who never investigate the past and now are living the consequences. So, and definitely I congratulate all of you for this initiative. I know Azerbaijan has a very difficult period and has to investigate what happened for the people who got disappeared during the conflict. It's a state responsibility, and the families have the right to know what happened. So thank you very much for this opportunity to do some reflection.